Welcome to the Ouija board, an interactive story in which you direct the outcome. This interactive horror story is simple. At moments throughout the video, you will be given a choice on which direction to take the story. Simply go to the timestamp or chapter displayed on screen, once prompted, to select your choice and change the outcome of the story. For more information and guidance, pause the video right now, read the description or pinned comment section. Then hit the lights, hit the play button, and enjoy this interactive horror story, The Ouija Board. Willow trees draped over Elm Street like fog rolling in from the Atlantic coast, casting constant shadows over the New England suburb of Wallenberg. An autumn wind shook the leaves from the willow's neighbouring oak giants, the controlled woodland lining the road since before the witches of Salem were even of memory. The citizens of Wallenberg used Elm Street to escape their small town filled with gossip, guilt, and grey skies, the one way out of Wallenberg that didn't include prying neighbours' eyes to see who was leaving with whom. It allowed the youth of the village to play outside their parents' supervision, an innocent hideaway tucked underneath a canopy of leaves, sap, and ghosts of those who never left their town of 10,000. One of those unlucky lifetime residents was Olivia Hawthorne, a middle-aged woman finding solitude under the grandiose willow branches as she walked down Elm Street for the umpteenth time. She stared straight ahead at the winding road with an emptiness in her eyes, going through the motions, breathing in deep but barely letting out a sigh. Her thoughts were not on the building wall of clouds overhead, nor the haunting whistle singing through the treetops above her, nor the circles under her maple-brown eyes from a lack of sleep. Olivia was entrenched with sadness, attempting to mask her melancholy with the full foliage around her New England surroundings. Initially begging to forget that it was once the one-year anniversary since her beloved husband and Wallenberg businessman David Hawthorne passed away in a tragic blaze at his coffee and tea cafe. Ultimately, the grief wouldn't give way to the tiresome fight for closure, and Olivia turned off Elm Street towards Hayden Boulevard, the home of Wallenberg Cemetery and David's final resting place. At David's tombstone, Olivia laid down the bunch of lavender she had grown from the last of her husband's seed bank in their garden, which had disappeared almost as quickly as he had. The purple petals stuck out in the grey and gloomy cemetery, and Olivia let a few tears trickle down her flushed cheeks as she read David's birth and death dates over and over again, as if they'd somehow disappear and David would return. "You'd be so disappointed in me, letting myself go about like this," Olivia said aloud. Embarrassed despite her isolation, "I just miss you so much." Olivia pulled out a tissue to wipe away the emotion and chuckled, a fond memory filling her mind. "You'd tell me to fix myself a bowl of ice cream, listen to the wind chimes on the front porch, and smile at the sun, just like I did on our first date at Willoughby's." Olivia grinned even brighter, the thought of their first date reveling the sour stain in her soul. She kissed the palm of her hand, placed it on David's tombstone, and left Hayden's cemetery with a few more tears to give. It was only a few minutes until Olivia arrived at downtown Wallenberg, its historic main street decaying to the suburban sprawl of new residents. Right in the middle of the half-cobblestone-lined storefronts was Willoughby's Ice Cream Parlour, a Wallenberg icon known for its soft serve and homemade waffle cones. Olivia had avoided returning for months, terrified that his bittersweet nostalgia and connection to her past would prove too much to bear. But Olivia felt empowered, for however fleeting those feelings were, and she ordered her favourite treat, 2 scoops of Rocky Road and chocolate syrup on the side. The cashier behind the counter did not dare ask Olivia why her eyes were so red, or why her lips trembled when she ordered, but rather let her go about her afternoon, searching for the quick fix in what was becoming the second hardest day of her life. As Olivia sat down on the sidewalk patio, she looked around at the fellow Wallenberg couples enjoying what could be first dates of their own, lost in the innocent charm Olivia so desperately wanted back. She frowned as she dumped her entire cup of chocolate syrup on her ice cream, but could barely get a single spoonful to her mouth before a raspy yet deep voice called out from behind her. "Never seen someone do that before." Olivia turned around to see an elderly gentleman, no younger than 80 years old, sitting at the table behind her. He smiled at her, half toothless, chuckled as she tried to make sense of his sudden appearance when he hadn't been sitting there mere moments prior. Putting syrup on your ice cream like that? You must be the type who likes things her own way, having control of the situation, eh? Olivia shrunk at the strange old man's observation, half disturbed, half embarrassed by his accuracy. Mind if I sit with you for a second? Olivia was too shocked to give a proper answer, and the man got up rather gingerly before sitting in the seat opposite of Olivia, studying her with his fading pupils, his eyelids wrinkled like wrapping paper. Kind of an odd thing to sit at an ice cream parlor shop by yourself on a day like today. What brings you back here so solemnly? Olivia stared at her ice cream, no desire for eye contact. It's where my husband and I shared our first date. How romantic of you, and kind of peculiar too. Peculiar, Olivia questioned. Sure thing. Willoughby's is where my wife and I also shared our first date. Oh, where is she? Passed away about 50 years ago. Long gone. I'm sorry to hear that. Olivia pushed away her bowl of ice cream, appetite officially depleted. Not to worry in the world, dear. I should be asking you the same question. Where is your husband? Olivia finally looked the man in the eyes, fighting back tears as if her life depended on it. He also passed, a year ago today. The old man didn't flinch, almost expecting Olivia to say such a thing. He only nodded, giving her space for the first time. Olivia thought for a moment, opening up after months of agitation. These last 50 years, what has helped you cope? How have you managed to get through it all with a smile on your face? The old man furrowed his brow, as if he was confused by such a question. That's easy, young lady. I don't miss her at all, so there's no coping. You see, we still speak every day. You what? Olivia quipped back. You heard me. We still converse a few times a day, as clearly as you and I are right now. Olivia couldn't blink, her mind racing. Was the old man showing his age? Was he kidding? Was she dreaming or hallucinating, or making it all up? She didn't even want to ask for an explanation. It was all so bizarre. She'd rather get up and walk away and leave the rest up to fate. But she couldn't. How? Olivia asked, almost begging for a morsel of hope. An Ouija board, of course, the old man replied. An unsettling grin stretched across his face. I know you won't believe me, even for a second. Most people don't, but done the proper way. The old man's grin became a full-blown smile. Anything is possible. Olivia looked around her to make sure she wasn't alone, her heart racing, now fearful of the man's uncomfortable demeanor. I'll tell you what, the man said, as he reached for a business card in his front pocket of his tattered button-up shirt he wore. If you decide you want to try out this little solution I've discovered, the toy shop on Crystal Lane should have a board for sale. The man put the card on the tabletop, only for it to be thrown back in his face by Olivia. I don't need any help, mister. Please don't speak to me again, she retorted, standing abruptly from her chair and leaving the ice cream with the old man, who stared at the back of her head, his gentle eyes suddenly filled with menace. As the sun set on Wellenberg later that evening, Olivia nestled on her couch, eyes glued to the fireplace in front of her, letting the crackling flames fill in the otherwise silent night. She couldn't stop relaying the conversation with the old man at Willoughby's over and over again in her head. His sudden appearance, his interest in her life, his unsettling grin as she spoke her truth. All of it rubbed her the wrong way, and yet she still wondered, with a slither of curiosity, if this man could be telling the truth, a sickening side effect of grief and false hope. To distract herself, as she usually did, Olivia pulled out her old Polaroid photograph of her deceased husband David, standing on a New England shoreline, posing for the camera with an innocent bliss. Unknowing of his unfortunate future, Olivia took the photo wherever she went because she felt it was the perfect portrait of David as a human being, and a snapshot of what she wanted back in her life. Tonight of all nights, the desire was like never before. It almost seemed like David came alive in that picture. On the 1-year anniversary of his death, beckoning his widowed wife to jump inside of the frame and spend eternity on the white sand beaches under a soft glowing sun. forgetting the rest of the world and ending the fight to make reality at least a tad more bearable. "I have nothing to lose," Olivia muttered under her breath as she slid the Polaroid back into her pocket, jumped up from the couch with her overcoat in hand, and glided out the front door on a mission to make sense of everything once and for all. Within minutes, Olivia was back in downtown Wellenberg, this time venturing along Crystal Lane, scanning the signage in front of the shops as business owners closed up for the evening. The stretch of dark window fronts discouraged Olivia, until near the very end of Crystal Lane, one store remained lit, a neon sign confirming it hadn't shuttered yet. Within its walls was M&M's Toy Emporium, a once famous landmark in Little Old Wellenberg that reached legendary status in the 1970s, but had since declined into mediocrity after the boom of electronics and video games left antique toy shops in their dust. Despite being a lifelong resident, Olivia had never ventured inside, but didn't have time for a ceremonial entrance. She knew what she was there for. Olivia swung open the heavy front door, only to be greeted by the strangest set of old porcelain dolls from the east side of the Mississippi River. The display case had been fastened with a series of 1930s collectibles, and the dolls were lined up as if an auction had just taken place. Their pitch-black eyes pierced Olivia as she stopped dead in her tracks, their frozen facial features funneling fear into those who decided to step back. Now Olivia felt like she was under surveillance, a stranger in the strangest of worlds. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the storekeeper asked Olivia from behind the counter. "We'll be closing in an hour." Olivia shook off the doll display and forced a smile towards the cash register. "I'm looking for board games, thanks." "Back left corner. Can't say the selection is any good." Olivia nodded at the silver-haired storekeeper and made her way to the back of the shop. Stacked on an unfinished shelf were a few dusty boxes of old board games. Olivia's fingers ran at the titles, passing over Stay Alive, Seance, and Which Witch, until at the very top she discovered an Ouija board. Curiously cleaner than the rest of the games, yet beat and battered, as if it had been thrown from a 3-story building. "Bingo," Olivia said aloud. "Quite the opposite of bingo, that was, I'm afraid," the shopkeeper stated, spooking Olivia as she jumped at his sudden appearance. The shopkeeper simply smiled a toothless grin and took the Ouija board from Olivia's grasp. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll knock 50 cents off the price if you promise not to return it. Too many kids come in here thinking they're funny and buy it only to bring it back a few days later, claiming it doesn't work. Rubbish is what I call it." "That's fine," Olivia responded, now just desperate to escape the toy store and never return, whether the Ouija board worked, its supposed magic or not. She walked back to the counter with the shopkeeper, threw down a few dollars, and briskly walked back out the front door, taking extra precautions not to look at the phantom porcelain faces as she did so. On Olivia's drive back to her woodland cottage, the clouds from earlier in the day had finally coalesced into a constant array of thunderstorms, thumping over the New England countryside, like timpani drums in an orchestra from hell. She did her best not to hydroplane across the pavement, knowing the roads were slick at night. Rain cascaded the front windshield, leaving Olivia to squint ahead, praying a deer or small animal wouldn't choose that night to dart across the road in search of shelter. As she pulled into her driveway, Olivia looked up at the cottage and watched the very moment where the power went out. Sparkings shooting out of the power lines draped between the pine trees scattered around the property. "You can't be serious," Olivia whispered to herself, dreading a long night of experimentation now guaranteed to take place in the dark. Lighting helped illuminate her path from the car to the cottage, but not before the torrential downpour soaked her head to toe. Back inside of her house, and in a fresh change of clothes, Olivia scavenged through a utility closet looking for a collection of candles, meant to save her from the frequent power outages in Wellenberg. Behind a bundle of fallen coats and outer garments, Olivia finally pulled out the bin of candlesticks, relieved knowing the day's endeavours were not over. She swiped a few matches from her bedside table and went about setting the candles around her chilly cottage, giving each room an ethereal glow, almost beckoning the spirits of the stars to shine through the monstrous claps of thunder and protect her from whatever mischief was ahead. After a few more minutes of burning the midnight oil and setting up her bedroom floor, Olivia finally sat down with the Ouija board in front of her. the carefully constructed wooden planchette resting in the center, beckoning her to begin communicating. Olivia looked on with growing trepidation, the confidence wearing thin, after diving headfirst into a borderline ridiculous last-ditch effort to console her grieving heart. In the end, though, she knew she didn't have much else of a choice. The wind outside howled, barren branches from the lone dead pine scratched the bedroom window pane, nails on a chalkboard for impending uncertainty, as Olivia took one final breath deep from within and looked at David's Polaroid. "Don't let me down," Olivia pleaded, as she released the air through pursed lips and laid both of her hands on the planchette. "Hello," Olivia said, a little louder, this time directed towards the Ouija board. She stared at the planchette, desperate for it to move, yet it didn't budge. "Hello," Olivia barked at the board, impatience overruling geniality. The planchette remained in its place, almost teasing the poor woman with silent amusement. Olivia wanted to give up, but felt David's eyes in the photograph beside her. She gripped the planchette as tight as she could and closed her eyes this time, reverting back to the calm character she suppressed. "Hello," she said, smooth like silk. Finally, the planchette budged from beneath her palms and started gliding across the Ouija board, stopping at various letters until the pattern spelled out hello, returning Olivia's greeting. Olivia did her best to keep her cool, but couldn't help letting a small smile form at the corners of her mouth. Is this real, she thought? A flash of light and a volcanic eruption of thunder that shook the floorboards beneath her were enough to remind her that it was indeed real. Unwilling for the moment to be ruined, Olivia locked back into her trance, again closing her eyes and squeezing the planchette as if her life depended on it. "Spirit with whom I communicate, this is, if you are a spirit at all, are you called David? Or, I guess a better question would be, were you once the man I loved and called my husband?" A moment or two of dead silence filled the room, the planchette seemingly back in its frozen state. A petrified Olivia opened one eye, a slow and seeping disappointment crawling underneath her skin. The other eye quickly followed suit. However, when the planchette eventually moved up into the right corner of the Ouija board, outlining the phrase Olivia was dead set on avoiding. No, the board displayed back. Whatever spirit entered the shadow-drenched room, it was a stranger to Olivia, a stranger she couldn't see, a harbourer of the unknown. Despite the unfortunate news, Olivia remained calm, assessing the situation without letting her emotions boil over. She looked intently at the board, now keeping her eyes open so as to not let her focus waver. "So, if you aren't David, who exactly are you?" The planchette budged from the top corner and slid down to the alphabet below. There it slowly spelled the letters N, I, and X, an unfamiliar phrase to Olivia. "Nix," she questioned innocently. "That's quite the name, rather unique if I say so myself." The planchette froze, ignoring Olivia's pleasantries. "Well, Nix, I guess if you aren't David, maybe you knew him. Were you once a human too?" Again the planchette moved back to display no, the strange spirit now confirming its supernatural origins. "I see," Olivia muttered to herself, glancing around the room, attempting to find any semblance of an idea of what Nix could be. "Are you a god of sorts then?" The planchette stood fixated on no. A demon? It didn't appear so. An animal? The planchette fixed on no, for only a moment more before it slid back down to the cachet of letters, the spirit surrendering from any more guessing games. It made its way across the alphabet, stopping on the letters B, then the letter I, then R, before stopping on D, giving Olivia her next clue. "Bird," she exclaimed, happy to be at least a step out of the darkness. "Nix the bird. Nix bird. Bird Nix." She continued to whisper, losing her sanity one random word combination at a time, before it finally smacked her right in the face. "Ah yes, I've got it. Nix, short for phoenix, the immortal bird of Greek legends. Olivia could hardly get the words out of her mouth without screaming from pride, "Are you actually a phoenix?" For the first time, the planchette danced across the board to display yes, affirming Olivia's clever word association. Olivia pumped her fist with delight, almost forgetful of where she was and what she was doing. She looked down at the Polaroid of David once again, and all of a sudden the excitement turned to a tearful realization. David's favourite creature was a phoenix. He loved Greek mythology, and always talked about how cool it would be if we as humans figured out a way to be reborn from the ashes. I always thought it was silly getting hung on folklore like that, Olivia reminisced to the Ouija board, as if Nix was perched right in front of her, listening to her eulogy. He'd love to say, "I told you so" right about now. A tear fell from Olivia's cheek as she internally chided herself for not appreciating the finer details when she should have years ago. "Did David send you to bring me a message from your world, or maybe just to say hello?" Olivia asked through an increase of tears. She watched the planchette as it fumbled between yes and no, instead returning to the alphabet and slowly marking off the letters to spell B-U, R and N. "Burn," Olivia gasped, letting go of the planchette from shock, quickly attempting to decipher if Nick simply made a mistake, or if their command was as harrowing as it seemed. "Could you repeat your response for me, Nix? I'm afraid my emotions are getting the best of me." Olivia begrudgingly clasped her fingers around the planchette, the most apprehensive she'd been yet. Her hesitancy turned to horror as the planchette guided her to spell burn for a second time. "I don't know what you want me to do, Nix. Burn what? I have nothing here to burn." Olivia looked around her, the bed empty sans her furniture and a few books. Surely those couldn't be of any importance to the Ouija board. She looked down at her lap and realized what the spirit must be talking about. Her prized picture of David at the beach. She picked it up, then looked at the board itself. "I guess it's either David or you," Olivia said towards the board, wondering if maybe Nix was giving her a sign to stop the excitement rather than destroy her favourite memento of her late husband. Olivia breathed in deep, knowing what she was about to do could destroy everything she had held on to. Following the command, she stood up from her position and scooped up the Polaroid of David, walking to the bedroom door. Olivia threw it open with grace, trying to stay calm while savouring the moment, and tiptoed down the stairs. Once in the living room, she approached the fireplace, still sizzling from her evening fire. With a second of hesitation, Olivia lifted up the photo above her head and glared directly into the flames, whispering under her breath, "Please make it help." She then threw the precious Polaroid into the fireplace, watching with equal parts hope and fear as it was consumed by smoke and embers, turning to ashes. It only burned normally for a moment, however, before a glowing orb rose out of the fireplace and into the living room. It was hauntingly beautiful, an array of all things wonder and brilliance, like the sun became a ghost and shrunk itself to fit right inside of Olivia's two-story cottage. As the orb rose to the ceiling of the room, Olivia stood with a dropped jaw, nearly hanging to the floor, amazed at the scene in front of her. From the orb, a set of scarlet wings expanded on either side, radiating with colour, like a fire on the Sahara Desert. Eventually the orb disappeared, and from the remaining light pollution, an actual real-life phoenix manifested from the air, covered with feathers of every warm colour imaginable. Its golden beak gleamed from the light of the fireplace, a mythical creature reborn from the ashes of Olivia's memento. It looked down at the woman in shock before her, eyes piercing her soul, its graceful neck bending down, as if about to strike Olivia as its pending prey. Olivia still looked on with awe, nonchalant with her potential doom. "Are you Nix?" she asked. The phoenix nodded. "I've never seen something quite like you. No wonder David was so fascinated." Nix ruffled its feathers, allowing Olivia a few more moments to process what she had just witnessed. "I burned the photo like you told me to," Olivia explained. "What else can I do?" The mythical creature lifted its head and cried out with a majestic song, like 1,000 waterfalls crashing through wind chimes into a valley of harps and harmonies. Olivia covered her ears, the sound so powerful it rocked the inside of her head. The bird then came back down, beak to nose with Olivia. Nyx's eyes locked onto hers and opened its mouth. The phoenix spoke with a timbre, coming deep from within, using a non-binary voice that echoed like an organ in an old Catholic church. You have one wish to make, Olivia Hawthorne, to complete the journey you have begun. But choose wisely, for this wish will impact the finite time you have left to live on this earth. And I can wish for anything, Olivia clarified. Only what your heart desires most at this very moment, Nyx explained. Olivia closed her eyes, searching herself for what she truly desired. A year's worth of torturous pain and never-ending grief flashed behind her eyelids. Every muscle in her body tightened and tensed as she realized what she had not only wanted but genuinely needed. She knew that if she chose incorrectly, her death would be signed, sealed, and delivered, faster than a fox stuck in quicksand. Olivia opened her eyes and gazed into the eyes of the phoenix. I wish for the strength and perseverance to finally move past the trauma and sadness of losing my husband, and to begin my life anew. To find the closure I didn't know I needed, she said clearly and confidently. Nyx didn't hesitate and rose back up to the ceiling, spreading its wings with majestic force, and singing another song, this one ringing with joy and hope. From above, the wings of the phoenix swung down and pulled Olivia into its grasp. A wave of relief washed over Olivia's face, feeling safe and protected for the first time in a year. Around her and Nyx, a brilliant cylinder of light encompassed the air and surrounded the two beings, growing with an increasing amount of light until it was brighter than the sun. As the miniature star reached its peak, it exploded with a burst of sizzling sparks, the phoenix ceasing to exist. Simultaneously, the flames in the fireplace went out from the resulting gust of wind, as did every single candle left lit in the cottage. Once more, Olivia was cast in darkness as she floated gracefully down to the floor, landing on her feet, looking around for proof that what she just experienced was in fact a fraction of reality. The darkness only lasted for a few breaths, however, as the power was thankfully restored to Olivia's Wellenberg residence. Wow, Olivia whispered, still in awe. She glanced around the living room, everything still in its place. In the center of the room rested the Ouija board, the wooden planchette on top of its rightful place, as if nothing had ever happened. The rain outside subsided, the last clasp of thunder and a few flashes of lightning giving way in the distance. Inside the cottage, Olivia felt the same transition settle inside of her soul, grey skies and a constant cacophony parting for a new day. A few weeks passed, and Wellenberg carried on like always. The trees lost most of their leaves. Frost covered the fresh-cut lawns as residents packed up their things for a long winter ahead of them. Citizens of the New England village usually hated the time of year. Sunlight was sparse, the chill in the air cut through their clothes like razor blades, and the overall gloominess of the town hit like an avalanche. Nobody welcomed it with open arms. Rather, everyone retreated inside, giving up on escapism, until the flowers bloomed the following spring. That is everyone except Olivia Hawthorne, the lone resident embracing the days with hope. Back at her cottage one brisk morning, Olivia stood outside her two-car garage behind a mirage of folding tables, all dressed with odds and ends from within her home. Most of the collections consisted of men's clothing and shoes, books about mythology, and an assortment of comic books, movies, and video games. It was obvious Olivia had been hoarding her husband's belongings like trophies of yesteryear, thinking if she held onto them, she'd feel closer to David despite his death. Now she understood it was the release that would set her free, and sold them with a glimmer of peace in her eyes. All the money brought in today will go to a charity under David Hawthorne's name, Olivia announced to the crowd of Wellenberg citizens who climbed out of their cars to hunt for garage sale treasures. She spoke with vigor not many had heard in quite some time, and looked over her project, feeling a sense of closure finally rising to the surface. Are these really free? asked a man with a familiar voice behind Olivia. She whipped around, her smile fading, as she saw the old man from the ice cream parlour pointing at the pile of free items she had stashed in the back of the garage sale. "Oh hi, yes, anything in that pile is free," Olivia explained, forcing pleasantries when all she truly wanted to do was scream at the strange man. He grinned, knowing her discomfort was palpable. "Something caught my eye. Just wanted to be sure is all, darling," the old man replied. "Didn't mean to frighten you." He then moved aside a couple of old lamps and linens and picked up the Ouija board, stored away back in its original box. The old man held it as if he'd just recovered an old memory, a prize only he could appreciate. He looked up at Olivia, his wrinkles spread thin as he tipped his cap. Olivia stood mouth agape, a million thoughts swirling inside of her head. She went to shout something at the unsettling character, her voice caught in her throat. "Excuse me, miss." Olivia whipped around, a concerned citizen holding up one of David's old overcoats in front of her. "This coat is missing its price tag. Could you tell me how much it costs?" the resident asked. $10 is all, thanks," Olivia replied. She turned back around to finally address the old man, but she found the free pile deserted, the Ouija board out of sight. He had disappeared into thin air, a figure turned to shadow, turned to a mere mystery. Olivia shrugged and shook off the encounter, remembering why she was there. "Goodbye to old worries," she said under her breath, her whispers wafting into the winter's wind, becoming one with the willow trees, guardians of Valenberg, and the newfound hope that was rising within. Unable to cope with the unfortunate news, Olivia squeezed the planchette with all of her might, her tears now a pair of waterfalls, her veins bulging and brow sweating as she pleaded with Nyx for David to appear. "You're a spirit," she explained. "You live between worlds. You are neither dead nor alive. You can bridge the gap, otherwise why would you be here? You may not be David, but I demand you bring David to me immediately. I've waited too long and suffered too much to wait any longer. I'm tired of your games." The planchette froze, its energy ceasing as Olivia's voice cracked, her tears now puddling before her, just as she let go of the board. A massive clap of thunder rang out, like a leviathan rising from its slumber, rain thrashing the window like a tsunami of terror. Then there was a knock at the door. Olivia stopped crying as fast as she had started, perking up at the sound of a supposed visitor. She stood up ever so slowly, a death glare fixated on the bedroom door. Another knock shook her to her core as Olivia jumped into the air, the floorboards creaking under pressure. "Who's there?" Olivia called out. She was met with silence. "David, is that you?" Instead of a voice, Olivia's question was met with a third knock. Olivia finally made her way to the door. She turned around to look at the Ouija board, still in the same position it was before, lifeless and lonely. In front of her, she could feel the presence of something behind the door. Something or someone breathing life. Olivia closed her eyes, turned out the monsoon outside, and gently twisted the door handle to reveal her surprise guest. In the hallway stood the old man from the ice cream store, smiling his nefarious smile, holding a candle just below his chin, casting a shadow across his profile only the boogeyman could replicate. Olivia screamed, only to be silenced when the man stuck out his hand and covered her mouth. "Shush, darling, screaming solves nothing. You'll only wake the neighbours." Olivia quietened down, weirdly calmed by the old man's newfound geniality. "May I come in?" he asked, as he brought his hand down back to his burning wax. Olivia nodded and stepped aside, still not sure why she was all of a sudden so trusting of this strange figure before her. "I see you purchased the Ouija like I suggested. Good girl," the old man flaunted as he spotted the board in the middle of the room. "Looks like it's working all right." Olivia's brow furrowed. "I asked for David, my husband, not you. Why are you here?" she asked. "I think you've already answered that, Olivia," the man retorted. "I don't understand," Olivia said, despondent, unwilling to play any more mind games. "You asked for David to appear, and I arrived. The man who knew you'd be at Willoughby's today. The man who told you he'd been talking to his wife through an Ouija board. his wife, whom he also met at an ice cream shop. Olivia's eyes widened, her jaw dropped. David, she guessed. Hello, dear, the man revealed back. Olivia stuttered as she tried to reason with herself. How, though? You said earlier you'd been talking to your wife for years. I've never seen you before in my life, let alone a Ouija board. Maybe that was a projection of the future. I knew if I came back to Earth as an elderly man, you wouldn't recognize me, but might at least sense my wisdom and feel compelled enough to try. And I was right. Olivia broke down in tears once more and ran to David, taking the candle from him and holding it up to his wrinkled eyes, as she stared into their black and brown infinite, looking for the man she once loved. It is you. I'd know your eyes anywhere, Olivia whispered. The older version of David took the candle from Olivia's hands and set it down on the bed next to them, pulling her in for the embrace she had been waiting for 365 days. I don't know how you did it, Olivia wondered aloud. Maybe I don't want to know. I'm just happy you're here with me now. Old or not, I still love you with all my heart. That's good, darling. Olivia pulled back, a bit startled. Don't you still love me back? The elder David looked down, ashamed at what he was about to say. I do love you, Olivia, I promise I do, but I must be completely honest. I was allowed to return to you and share this moment on one condition. David trailed off, his next word too painful to bear. What? Olivia beckoned. Because you demand that I appear, and because I've shared with you my identity using the Ouija board for our gain, you must sacrifice the life you still have and depart this world for the spiritual realm to come back with me, David explained. Olivia's face contorted, the unrelenting truth more terrifying than she could possibly imagine. You mean I have to die? Die with me, yes, but it's the price we must pay for tapping into such supernatural power, David said, gesturing towards the Ouija board. Olivia glanced around her, at her minimal possessions and lack of imagination. She knew she'd be giving up on her dreams and abandoning the promise she posed as a young woman. But she couldn't comprehend saying goodbye to David once again. Here he finally was, and regardless of his transformation, Olivia still felt the spark she felt the first day they met. I'm scared, Olivia admitted. I'm not sure I'm ready to die. I'm not sure you have much of a choice, David muttered, now gripping Olivia's wrist with a force beyond compassion or empathy. Can't I have a moment to say goodbye, Olivia requested. We don't get that privilege, my darling. I didn't, and neither can you, David said. C'est la vie. David pulled at Olivia's arm now, revealing a strength abnormal to a frail old man of his state and stature. The thunder resumed outside, flashes of lightning illuminating the couple's struggle, as Olivia tried to free herself from David's grip. No, she shouted. You wanted to be with me, Olivia. It's time to take that leap, David instructed. David dragged the couple back to the center of the bedroom, where the Ouija board began to glow like an ethereal orb of a galactic dimension. The planchette shined like 1,000 stars, the light startling Olivia and her earthly eyes. David unfazed in his spiritual form. Olivia stopped in her tracks, in awe of the sight before her. She looked to her undead husband, the weight of the world and her entire life weighing down on her shoulders. David turned his head back to her, the whites of his eyes giving way to the blacks of his pupils, an expression more lifeless than the porcelain dolls at the toy shop. Time to go, David said, focusing back on the Ouija board. Now an all-encompassing portal to the spiritual realm from which he came. Olivia closed her eyes for what could be the final time as David led her into the blinding light, stepping into the portal opened by the Ouija board. The couple walked through what felt like an underground tunnel plastered with brilliant white walls, so illuminating one couldn't possibly see where they were going. Olivia tried to open one eye to see the path before her, but could only make out the shape of David in front of her, guiding them into eternal nothingness. Eventually the harsh lighting faded into a much more manageable, incandescent atmosphere. Olivia blinked a few times and focused her gaze on the new surroundings. Around her were massive murals stretched along the walls of the tunnel they had entered, displaying moving images of static and white noise, as if old 35mm projectors were casting old films from the ceiling. A mist hung low on the floor, covering David and Olivia's feet, like clouds caressing a mountain. It seemed more like a historian's underground archive, a dungeon of eternal memory, cold and unwelcoming. Olivia shivered, her teeth chattering a bit. "This is where you came from?" Olivia asked David, unperturbed by the gloomy atmosphere. "Of course, this is where I spend all of my time," he replied. "It's so empty," Olivia wondered aloud. "Just wait," David reassured her. The static from the projections cut out, and in its place, memories from David and Olivia's life together started playing on the walls. Olivia quickly forgot about the drab tunnel of limbo and became fixated on the memories dancing around the tunnel. She laughed as she watched her younger self meet David at a party held by their mutual friend, his charm winning her over, her laughter and love of life putting a fire in his eyes. David once again grabbed Olivia's hand and guided her along the tunnel, the projected memories changing the further they went along. Olivia didn't care where she was going at this point, now infatuated by a sense of safety and serenity. She smiled at their first date playing out before them, this time both a young David and young Olivia, sharing their favourite desserts together. This memory blended in with their wedding day. Olivia flourished in a white dress as she danced with David under the stars of a New England night. As the couple moved further down the tunnel, they ran into spiritual spectators also admiring the Hawthorns' love story. These beings looked just like humans, dressed in garb from a different era, like 1930s Great Britain. They did not look at nor acknowledge David and Olivia's presence, but rather stared unblinkingly at the walls, as if waiting for something to happen that would release them from their unwavering hypnosis. "Who are these people?" Olivia asked. "Spirits of the spirit realm, darling, but pay them no attention," David instructed. Olivia tried to forget about the growing crowd of figures around her and watched as the projections displayed David and Olivia's honeymoon. David's arms around Olivia's waist as they peered over the endless Atlantic from the coastal resort, the sun setting and covering their faces with an orange glow. A warm and promising visual. Before long, the honeymoon became daily life, with dinners and dates and simple moments covering the walls. The happy life the couple knew just before tragedy hit them. This was right before you passed, Olivia realized. Will these memories restart? David looked away from his wife, the emotion from his face depleted. Around them, the spiritual spectators changed and transformed in real time. The skin melted from their faces, their clothes falling off in heaps of dust, deteriorating as their eyes sunk deep into their skulls and rolled over black. They started moving like zombies, demented creatures of a horrifying degree, slowly stomping towards Olivia, moaning like monsters, desperate for a soul to snack on. "David, what is happening?" Olivia cried out. David didn't reply, but rather stuck out an arm and pointed to the projected walls. Across them started playing new memories, ones foreign to Olivia's recollection. She saw a younger version of herself crying at the dining room table, waiting for a phone call until a younger David walked into the room. Relief washed over her, and the two projections embraced. "That was the night I learned you died," Olivia muttered. More fake memories played out, becoming darker in nature and polarized from the previous projections. Olivia watched a different timeline of her and David's relationship, filled with nasty arguments, scandals, and emotional turmoil. "Is this what would have happened?" Olivia asked David, as the ghoulish spirits closed in on the couple. She couldn't help one last look at the screen as she watched another older version of David leave Olivia in tears. His bags packed, his face snarling, shouting the words, "I don't love you anymore." The Olivia of the present sobbed uncontrollably. "Please make it stop," Olivia demanded, as the foul memories replayed once again. "How could you show me any of this? I was better off not knowing." The present version of David laughed maniacally, his false pretense of guiding Olivia into some sort of afterlife, full of solitude, now fading away, his true colours revealed. "You were always so naive, Olivia," David said between cackles. "Thinking you could raise me from the dead and enter some happily ever after. I died for a purpose. Our marriage was heading towards a dead end. This isn't a fairy tale, darling, and I'm no knight in shining armour." "You didn't have to be one," Olivia choked back. "You didn't have to come back and sweep me off my feet. You'd already done that. You saw us on the walls. I just wanted to be with you, David. I just wanted to feel your presence again, but you deceived me, and now I feel like I truly have lost you forever." David continued to laugh, Olivia's tearful monologue uninterrupting his evil power trip. "Don't mess with the dead. Deception is only one of our many tricks," David said. "Please don't hurt me again," Olivia trailed off as David's laughter humiliated her into silence, the half-dead spectators close enough to breathe on Olivia. Their rotting flesh hung off the bone, their teeth mangled and chipped away, stopping inches away from her face as they hung their heads back and began laughing along with David. Their cackles echoed with a depraved and devilish sound, like the starved hyenas or sirens from the ninth circle of hell. Olivia could do nothing but be consumed by the orchestra of ominous voices. She tried to fight and flail through the mass of monsters but couldn't budge, instead watching as her skin began to wrinkle, her hair began to grey, her back began to warp, and her eyes began to squint. Olivia aged into an elderly and emaciated woman before her very eyes, the spirit spinning her through a time warp of regretful punishment, losing what was left of her life. The light emanating from the projections on the walls began to flicker, and Olivia was cast into darkness once more, a complete opposite from the building light she entered in. Slowly but surely, the roar of rumbling thunder re-entered the soundscape, letting Olivia know she was back at her bedroom in Wallenberg. After a few moments, the power came back on within the house, the storm outside giving way to dark blue twilight skies. Olivia opened her eyes and almost fainted from disbelief. Her room was fixed exactly as before, except it was now covered in cobwebs and calcification. The furniture was full of dust, the walls covered in mildew and mould, the ceilings deteriorating and wooden planks protruding from the walls, as if no one had stepped foot in the home for 75 years. Olivia moved back over to the mirror and let out a blood-curdling scream when she saw her new appearance. The broken old woman she had become in the spirit realm did not revert back to normal. She stared at herself through heavy eyelids, her matted and messy silver hair falling out in clumps. The breath in her lungs felt sucked out, words lost in the rain outside. Olivia could do nothing but sit and wait to die, closer to her own demise now than she was just a few hours prior, eternally pained by her impatience, unchecked grief becoming the victor. "C'est la vie," Olivia whispered, succumbing to defeat as the passing storms rolled away into the distance, becoming a memory of its own. Olivia breathed in deep, knowing what she was about to do could destroy everything she had worked for. Ignoring the command, she leapt from her position and scooped up the Ouija board in her arms and bolted for the bedroom door. Olivia threw it open, not daring to look behind her, and scrambled down the stairs. Once in the living room, she approached the fireplace, still sizzling from her evening fire. Without hesitation, Olivia lifted up the board and planchette above her head and glared directly into the flames, whispering under her breath, "Please make it stop." She then threw the cursed board into the fireplace, watching with equal parts hope and fear as it was consumed by smoke and embers, turning to ashes. It only burned normally for a moment, however, before the fireplace exploded with massive flames and shooting sparks, the fire reaching an abnormal height, as if the Ouija board was fighting back with heated magic of its own. Olivia shielded her eyes as the red-orange glow consumed the room, threatening to burn the house once and for all. All hope seemed lost until the roaring flames sizzled to a whistle and the fire extinguished itself, along with all the candles in the house, throwing Olivia and her terror into a pit of pitch-black darkness. She remained in place, frozen with fear, unable to see even the hand she stuck up in front of her nose. "David, are you there?" Olivia called out, met only with silence. "David, please come out," she pleaded to seemingly no one, now the only person remaining in the room. Or at least she thought. "Don't freak out," Olivia said with a crack in her voice, knowing her self-motivating pleas were nearly useless. Light, candles, matches, she processed, now waving her arms in front of her, feeling for obstacles, trying to remember the layout of her living room, as the intermittent lighting provided a few seconds of relief, the thunder increasing with vivacity. A few times as Olivia climbed the stairs back to her bedroom, uncannily marked shadows blanketed the walls from the light that flashed through the windows. Shadows shaped like horned figures and winged beasts, stalking her along the journey to find matches. Olivia never quite noticed the vague visitors in her space, thinking they were probably just products of the medieval chandelier she hung over the foyer, or the crudely shaped bookshelf she stored in the hallway. Finally at her room, Olivia barged through the door, and from muscle memory marched across to her bedside table, where a smoking candle sat on top. The last candle she had lit earlier that evening. Please God, let them be here, Olivia prayed, feeling an uncomfortable lurking over her shoulder, as the swirling rain rapped against the window outside, crescendoing as the wind gusted harder, thunder shaking the second floor of the house. Olivia opened the drawer, felt around for a moment before feeling the familiar tiny wooden box stacked with matches fall right into her hand. Voila, Olivia exclaimed, pulling her prized possession from within the drawer. Her excitement waned immediately though, as the bedroom door slammed shut behind her, almost simultaneously, leaving her a statue once more. Hello, Olivia called out. David, did you return? She received no answer. Is someone there? This isn't funny anymore, Olivia cried, back in her anxious state. After another quiet second, a shuffling from across the room broke the tension, like massive wings flapping in a vortex. Paralyzed with fear, Olivia was able to reach her hand out for the smoking candle, pull a match out with her other hand, and strike it against the wall. She lit the candle with shaking limbs, trembling and troubled, and held it up in front of her. There was nothing there, and Olivia let out a sigh of relief. Thank you, she uttered. Olivia turned around to close the bedside table drawer and let out a shriek from the deepest depths of her soul, as the candle now illuminated a monstrous creature standing directly in front of her. A disgusting stench from the creature's breath washing over her. The beast looked like a human-sized vampire bat with scales covering its wings, fangs protruding from its mouth, like stalactites in an abandoned cavern. Its black eyes, void of a friendly demeanour, pierced Olivia like a dagger. It was so terrifying, Olivia ran out of energy to scream, her open mouth emitting nothing in return. The creature hissed, revealing a serpent's tongue, flicking sludge-filled saliva all over Olivia, and flapped its wings. The stream of air funneled right at Olivia's candle, extinguishing it and all of the light it offered. Olivia was plunged into darkness once more, along with a feeling of loneliness. She stuck her hand out to feel for the creature's presence, but only touched air. She was now more confused than startled, wondering how she was still alive and why the demented bat from hell didn't eat her on sight. Am I hallucinating? Olivia wondered aloud. Doing her best to move on, she grabbed another match from the box and lit the candle again. Just as she was about to go back to her door, the vampire bat-like beast emerged from the shadows and blocked her path, now screeching louder than before, almost as if to alert Olivia the light was no longer allowed. It shook its wings and took the little flame out a second time, returning the room to its opaque visibility. Olivia would not be defeated so easily. She understood the beast was not there to kill her, and thus felt confident enough to light the candle one last time. However, upon the light re-entering the space, the bat used its razor-sharp talons and grabbed Olivia by the shoulders. Olivia froze as the creature's rotten mouth opened slowly, and instead of a hiss or screech coming out, a dying human's voice, almost like that of an elderly man, croaked out instead. You tried to cheat the Ouija board, and nobody cheats the Ouija board without consequence. As your punishment, you will live in perpetual darkness every single night for the rest of your life. And if you attempt to light the candle, I will be here to extinguish both the flame and your soul. I was cursed either way, Olivia cried back to the monster. What else was I supposed to do? You had a choice, you stupid girl, but you chose to run away from the unknown instead of embracing it. And now you will live in the unknown, that is, the darkest part of night, all for eternity. The creature replied, blowing out the candle a third and final time and disappearing back into the thin air. Olivia was left to sob uncontrollably, the realization of her choices crashing down upon her, like the thunder of the Wellenberg countryside, rumbling alongside infinite rain, gloom, demise, and darkness. Olivia opened her eyes and gazed into the eyes of the phoenix. I wish my once dead husband, David Hawthorne, could join me as a physical entity and speak to me one final time, she said clearly and confidently. Nyx didn't hesitate and rose back up to the ceiling, spreading its wings with majestic force and singing another song, this one with melancholy and sorrow. From the fireplace, a second orb of undying light manifested under guidance from the phoenix, floating across the room and landing next to Olivia. Out of the orb sprouted 2 human arms and 2 human legs, with tattered and torn clothing stretched across their limbs, charred shoes placed on their feet. The rest of the orb died down, and from the centre, a younger version of David was born. "David," Olivia exclaimed, running towards her undead husband, only to stop in her tracks, when he lifted his head to reveal a face full of third-degree burns, nearly unrecognisable. "Oh my," Olivia could barely get the words out of her mouth. She slowly inched towards David, who stared at her with only one eye, the other socket void of anything. A hole in his cheek revealed a bruised jawbone, his hair mangled where it was burned off completely. He looked as if he had crawled out of a plane crash, surviving on the last few ounces of blood that coursed through his body. To an innocent bystander, David appeared to have crawled out from hell itself, his wounds the prize he'd won from his last year of eternal suffering. But Olivia knew better, and the truth was most painful of all. David came back how he must have looked the moment he passed away a year before, burnt to a crisp after being trapped in a fire at the store he owned. She never saw the body, but she couldn't bear to witness her beloved husband in such a state, and his identity was confirmed by a relative. But now she had no such choice, and saw with her own eyes the torturous scars left on David's body, too frightening to ever wipe from her memory. "Can you speak?" Olivia asked what was left of David. All he could do was shake his head, his vocal cords destroyed by the smoke. "Can you feel?" Olivia continued, desperate for some sort of connection. David looked at his hands and shrugged, but beckoned Olivia closer to give it a try. She ran towards him, arms outstretched herself. "I can't let you go again," she sobbed, wrapping herself around David's body, fresh tears streaming down her face. David brought his broken arms up and held onto Olivia's back, at first gently, before slowly but surely gripping the clothes she was wearing. Olivia's eyes darted open, a burning sensation overcame her. She looked down and saw David's body covered in flames, a fire now spreading onto her own figure. "Wait, I can't actually let go." Olivia panicked as she realized she was stuck in David's inflamed embrace. "David, let go, we're on fire." David ignored Olivia's pleas, trapping Olivia in a column of smoke. He then backed up, step by step, pulling Olivia with him, and traversed back towards the fireplace where he came from. Olivia fought with all of her might, but could not be separated from the now lifeless and demented figure of David Hawthorne, who dragged them both into the embers, sinking into the fireplace as if it were an elevator to the underworld. "Help me," Olivia screamed, her voice lost in the echoes of the chimney before disappearing into the vast of hell. Outside, the thunderstorms dissipated, dawn fast approaching. Still floating in the living room was the phoenix, a platinum tear falling from its eye, mourning Olivia's avoidable demise and her refusal to let go of her grief. It sang one last song, a discordant lullaby in a minor key, and returned to its spiritual state as an orb of light. The orb then sank back to the floor, manifesting back into the Ouija board, settling still, as the first ray of sunlight peeked through the window, casting a spotlight on the cursed game of indecision, darkness, and death.